Today we're going to start Chapter 10, Section 1, and we're talking about in this whole chapter are the presidential qualifications and leadership. I think it's really important to start off by saying that we in the United States use free and fair elections because they're essential to our democracy. But just the election itself is not enough. A nation must also be able to transfer power from one person who has a political party to another. Looking up there on the top, you see the last two presidents we've had, the United States, Barack Obama to the left and Donald Trump to the right. The transition of power from a Democrat to a Republican and vice versa is something that's part of our tradition and our history, and why we have countries that have rulers of democratic values rather than kings. So in today's discussion, we're going to talk about identifying the formal qualifications of the president, which are pretty straightforward. We're going to explore the job of the president, including informal roles. We're going to identify the pay and benefits for being president. And we're also going to look at the article. You're going to have a little bit of an assignment, which is reading and discussing the article called The Loneliest Job. I think it's really important that we look at, what the effects of time and stress have on a president. I think this is a really telling image. And if you look at a lot of the presidents you've had in history, on the left side you see Barack Obama in his first year as president. On the right side, 8 years later, you can see the aging, the effect it has on him. And so often they call the President of the United States the leader of the free world. They also say that it's the loneliest job in the world because at the end of the day, that person has to make the decisions that are going to have a large effect on the majority of our public. We're going to be looking at, in class, a magazine article from Time in partnership with CNN. And it says, according to the article, what do you think the most difficult thing about being president is? And then I want you to also reflect, it's been 3 years since President Obama has been out of office. What do you think that he has done? Has your opinion of his changed? Meaning that right now we see a lot of the long-lasting effects or results of his administration. Health care, an economy, all these effects of the decisions he made for those 8 years are starting to come to fruition now. Do you feel better than when he was in office, or what? I want you to kind of think about that and discuss it afterwards in class. So the first thing is the formal qualifications. According to the Constitution, the president has to be a natural-born citizen of the United States. He has to be at least 35 years old, and they must have resided in the United States for 14 years. And I said he, it's he or she. Obviously, we have a lot of female candidates who run for president as well. So those are the main qualifications. A lot stricter than the House of Representatives, and a little bit stricter than that of the Senate, especially with the whole idea of the 14 years. Again, you have to think about when the Constitution was written and the expectations about who would be president and when. A presidential term should last about 4 years. Each president may serve 2 terms. Typically, then the longest a president can serve is 8 years. However, if the vice president must step up and become president midterm for 2 years, he may still run for the additional terms remaining, which means we could have a president potentially for up to 10 years. Obviously, in the past, this was changed with the constitutional amendment, which we've talked about before. FDR serving the longest terms that we've ever had. After that, of course, we cut down to a 2-term limit, which that means if you're in the third year of a presidency and something happens to the president, the vice president would take office because of succession. And then he or she may run for 2 more terms, which means that they would have a longer term than what's defined by the Constitution with our amendments. Of course, Franklin D. Roosevelt, up to 1951, the Constitution placed no limits on the number of terms a president can serve. So he served as president from 1933 to 1945. 1951, the Constitution was amendment for the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidential terms again to 2. So why? And what we're going to discuss in class is should we have or should we not have term limits? There's a big push right now. There's been a push for the last several years. You have a lot of people in Congress who've served for life. Should we have presidential term limits? Should we have term limits for all branches of government? So to look back at the job description of the president, again, to say the president of the United States is known as the leader of the free world. Simultaneously, they fill at least 8 different roles. They are the chief of state, the chief executive, chief administrator, chief diplomat, commander-in-chief, chief legislator, chief of the party, I like the smiley face there, and the chief citizen. I'm going to go through a little bit in detail to explain what these are. The chief of state, this means that the president is the ceremonial head of the government of the United States, the symbol of all people of the nation, reflective of the goals, the values, the norms, and everything else that we looked at when you're talking about president. So I think that this is kind of interesting. And on your book, on page 289, and I don't have this in here, but when we're saying what are the standards and goals or norms that we're looking for when we're trying to vote for a president, statistics. This is from 2007. And I want to show you this, explain this real quick. Republicans or people who lead Republican, this is the top 5 qualities that they're looking for. Number 1 is honesty and straightforwardness. Number 2 is leadership and strength. Number 3 is integrity. Number 4 is competent to govern effectively. Number 5 is good moral character or family values. Now, the people on the Democratic side, or the people who lean Democratic, they also have their 5 top qualities that they're looking for. Number 1, the same as Republicans, honesty and straightforwardness. Number 2, listen to people, not special interests. Number 3, put U.S. first and focus on domestic issues first. Number 4, leadership and strength. And number 5, the ability to competently govern effectively. So you have a lot of similarities just about, again, the average voter, the average Republican versus the average Democrat. What would they mean when they're looking for who is going to be that person who is the symbol of all people of our nation or the chief of our state? They're also the chief executive, which means that the president is vested by the Constitution with executive power of the United States. Again, it's the most powerful office in the world, with checks and balances being from the legislative and the judicial branch. A good picture there, too, you have the 43rd president of the United States, George Bush, and the 44th president of the United States to the right, Barack Obama. This is, of course, during that transition of power, showing that you have the ability to give up that power at any time, which was so important from the beginning of our country when you talk about people like George Washington and why he didn't want to become the king of the United States, and rather he turned, they coined the term president, somebody who was just presiding for a temporary time. They're also the chief administrator, which means the president is the director of the entire executive branch of the federal government. Under President Obama, there has been an increase in federal employees. We have the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, etc. A lot of these branches are found off of what's happening, basically what exists and why it exists. For instance, the Department of Homeland Security, that was formed under President George W. Bush, but obviously whenever things happen, we have to add more people or more responsibility to try to react to what's happening. This goes all the way back to the progressive era of the 1850s to 1920s. When we realized that we had to have the government's role changed under Roosevelt and under Taft and under Wilson, where we saw that the government we were expecting more from our government, meaning how could we, instead of us just paying taxes, why do we have something that we get back from it? The president is also the chief diplomat of the world, and this means the president is the main architect of the United States foreign policy and the nation's chief spokesperson to the rest of the world. So examples of this are taking trips around the world and meeting with fellow presidents or prime ministers, making speeches abroad. They also kind of delegate a lot of that responsibility to the Secretary of State, who fills out that role of taking out the president's agenda and spreading it across the world. The president is also the commander-in-chief, and this means the president is in control of the nation's military. According to President George Bush's book, the aspect of the job was his favorite. The president's in charge of the Army, the Navy, Air Force, etc., and they make the ultimate decision on going to war, with Congress having to pass an official declaration. Again, this is that whole idea of checks and balances. So the president can't just declare war on his own, even though we've seen a lot of those things happen when you talk about some conflicts, but the president has to have Congress pass that official declaration because Congress has the power of the purse. The president's also the chief legislator, which means the president is the main architect of public policies. The president sets a congressional agenda, and an example there was with Barack Obama was health care reform. So the president, which we know as the Universal Health Care Act, a lot of people call it, to try to have a negative connotation, they try to call it Obamacare. For those who don't care for it, it's the whole idea of this is the agenda of the president, but he or she has to get Congress on board in order to pass a lot of these different agendas. The president is also known as the chief of the party, which means the president is acknowledged as the leader of his political party. Example, President Obama is the leader of the Democratic Party right now. At the same sense, right now, President Donald Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. That's the platform for which they are working from, is that person. But also the chief citizen, which means the president is expected to be the representative of all people. He's expected to do the work and represent the public interest, meaning the popular sovereignty, the popularity of what people are feeling, but also respecting both sides. You can't just be a president for the Democrats. You can't be just a president for the Republicans. You have to be the president of the United States and all its people. So what's important about this? They're all connected. The decision the presidents make as one role always affects the other roles. For example, the decisions that President Trump has made as chief legislator has affected his role as the chief of the party, meaning his legislative agenda might be very different from what the party's used to be. The party then has to figure out if that's the type of leadership they want, and they typically keep that president in power, or you have the chance to see people come up and challenge, perhaps a primary challenge against the president to try to take him out before he has to run for re-election again. So let's look kind of a quick overview of what the office entails and why it's important, what the roles are. In the next two sections, we're going to talk about the succession laws, meaning that who is next in line if something would happen to the president. And then finally, we're going to talk about how we select the president, which is the Electoral College, and the interesting history that we have there.